Chapter 1. Humphrey stood in passive horror as the figure advanced upon him. Genetically stocky, bordering on the obese, with significant facial hair and monobrow. And she wasn't alone. "Listen, you. Oh, I might have known you'd just sit there smirking at me. I suppose you're happy now, aren't you? Well, don't just sit there shaking your head at me. Listen, I don't like you and I don't respect you, right? Do you get that? Well, don't just sit there nodding at me. I always knew you'd divorce me. I always knew you would, because you're a pig. You've got no compassion, no morals. You're nothing but a spiteful and vindictive swine, Humphrey. And another thing, you might well have divorced me, but I'm glad you did. And do you want to know why? Because it was my idea, that's why. Do you understand that? Yes, that's right. So you can't hold that over me. I'm happier now than I have been in years, and I'm already looking for another man. Wait a minute, what am I saying? I'm looking for a man, because you certainly don't qualify. You never did. Sandra agrees with me too, and God knows she knows all about men. Well, don't look at me like that, Sandra. Oh, thank goodness, she'd taken a breath at last. This was typical Anthea, getting an attack in before anyone else could. It had been the same throughout their marriage. Humphrey shuddered. Yes, certainly it had, particularly with regard to those extremely hard to evade bedroom activities. He sent a cheery "Good morning" in Sandra's direction, being unsure as to when, or indeed if, he would ever be able to get another word in. What Sandra was even doing there was a mystery. The two women didn't get on, even at the best of times. Not that Anthea had ever had too many of those, of course, certainly not since she found herself lumbered with him. She must have told him that hundreds of times over the years in no uncertain terms. Maybe Sandra was there to remind her sister to stop talking every once in a while and to actually breathe occasionally. Humphrey suddenly realised that his ex-wife wasn't talking. She wasn't even muttering under her breath about how useless he was. Was she even breathing? Had Sandra failed at even that basic task? He thought for a moment. He would need a mirror. That would soon bring her around anyway, for better or worse. As luck would have it, he just happened to have one on him. It was part of his new man penknife, which included no actual knife, but which did manage to incorporate a mirror, a raspberry lip balm, and a pair of eyebrow tweezers. He moved very carefully towards her, but then hesitated, reluctant to take that final step, the one that would take him close enough to see the crow's feet and the laughter lines. Hang about. Laughter lines? Oh no, she was off again. What was it going to be this time then? She was happy without him. Yes, he got that bit. She didn't look particularly happy though, even for her. She was telling him that she was in spades with no holds barred, but she certainly didn't look it. She didn't often smile under any circumstances though, to be fair to her. Not even one of those fake smiles where the mouth moves, but the eyes wish you every possible evil under the sun. God, she was gorgeous when she was angry. There was something about that bulging eye and jabbing finger combo that really did things to him. "Did you want to see me, Anthea?" Humphrey smiled at her endearingly. Or so he hoped, anyway. It was an expression he'd practised many a time. Charming, yet vulnerable. That was the aim. Here, speaking of aim, what was she doing with that vase? With some relief, he watched her place it back down on his desk. "Did I want to see you what? Dead? Now you're well and truly talking. How about naked?" That sounded cheerful enough, although he thought it prudent to actively assess his escape routes at that point, just in case she decided to take him up on that sadly not very generous offer. He needn't have worried. That would hardly be worth your while, Humphrey. Ouch. Now that really was disappointing. She'd resorted to an attack on the physical. Her insults were usually so much better than that. There was no denying it. He felt cheated. "I know you never loved me, Humphrey." Well, at least she'd feel a bit better for having got that off her chest. Wallowing in self-pity was her version of some sort of luxury spa day, and her ex-husband was having none of it. "You never loved me either, then." Anthea gasped. Sandra looked ashen. "Either? Oh, Jesus. She'd insulted him first. He was only trying to agree with her. She'd only gone and changed the bloody rules on him again. Pitifully, he began pleading his case. There should obviously never, ever have been an either. He hadn't been thinking straight, and it just sort of sneaked out. There should not have been an either. There should have been a no, delivered with great emphasis and indignation, and then nothing more. Or if he hadn't felt quite so tired, he might have embellished it ever so slightly with a, "Of course I did." Or if he hadn't been quite so cowardly, he might even have made it a nice round suicidal, "No, I'm sorry, but you're wrong." Unlikely though, that one, under the circumstances. Hardened Spartan warriors might have had second thoughts about telling Anthea she was wrong. Still, she would have to be impressed by one thing: the revelation that he was such an expert ballistics marksman that he'd somehow managed to shoot himself in the foot, even while that foot was firmly jammed into his mouth. And she'd always told him he couldn't multitask too. Let me get this perfectly straight, Humphrey. You are, in effect, saying that I was so unattractive, so hideous, so vile, and so utterly repulsive that even you did not love me. She clenched her fist in that very particular way she seemed to have. Humphrey was too offended to pay all that much attention. Ray Mears would have been appalled at him. Hang on a minute, what do you mean, even me? I resent that, I'll have you know. Did he look offended? He really wanted to look offended. Did she look offended? No, she just looked dangerous. Really? You made love to me with all the enthusiasm of a cow on its way to the abattoir. Humphrey stared at her. There she was again, confusing love with making love. Why did his rather too successful attempts to match Usain Bolt's personal best, albeit in a far more squelchy event, automatically have to mean that he'd never loved her? Would a clapped-out cow on its way to a well-deserved eternal peace have been any worse off than him anyhow? Clapped out in his own way, and yet destined not for peace, but for ongoing intimidating appointments with regimented horizontal exercise. What a very clever move on her part. There was no arguing against a statement like that. There was no defence to an accusation like that. His own father couldn't have got him off a charge like that one. Strangely, Humphrey felt a sense of intense pride at that last little revelation. He could just imagine his father confidently oozing onto the scene, taking a brief look at the opposition, then doing a wide-eyed double-take of Anthea and running for his life. Why the hell was she staring at him like that? Ah, yes, she'd asked him a question, hadn't she? Albeit a fully loaded one, heavily disguised as a derogatory statement. Well, since there was no point in arguing with her, he decided to try and call a halt to the entire episode. "Oh, blow it out your ear, Anthea." Brave words, those, which was why he deftly moved to hide behind his former sister-in-law. Anthea's mouth fell open at his sheer audacity, not to mention his incredibly poor knowledge of anatomy. What sort of books on that subject could he possibly have been reading? Crap ones, by the sound of it, which might explain an awful lot of what had, and what usually had not, gone on during their marriage. "I suppose you're happy now, though, aren't you? Now you divorced me?" God, she was good. That entire statement had been expertly designed to make him say something that could immediately be taken out of context. He most certainly was happier now that he'd divorced her. There was no possible way he could deny that. Although Anthea herself had come up with the idea, on an almost daily basis actually, throughout most of their 12-year wedlock. That was an interesting word too, wedlock. It sounded like a judicial sentence of some kind. You will be taken from this confetti-strewn place to a roller coaster of intense human emotions, where you will serve 12 emotionally draining years of wedlock. Yes, after which time you'd be left as miserable and angry as Humphrey's ex-wife obviously was. In comparison to her, he was happy. At least she was finally talking to him again. As for him, these days he lived in a 3-room hovel-cum shoebox, shared a kitchen with the cast of A Bug's Life, and his dress collection was being slowly decimated by rising damp. There wasn't much of anything there to smile about. Aha! Of course, the perfect reply. Oh, this was going to be good. "I'm as happy as you are, Anthea." Brilliant. Sheer genius. She wasn't happy, and for her to have to admit that to him would have meant her having to admit that their divorce had been utterly pointless. Their marriage hadn't been working, that was true, but divorce should never have been on Brilliant. Sheer genius. She wasn't happy, and for her to have to admit that to him would have meant her having to admit that their divorce had been utterly pointless. Their marriage hadn't been working, that was true, but divorce should never have been the answer. And she could never give voice to that sort of statement without revealing some kind of deeper feelings, something that, as a general rule of thumb, she simply didn't do. That was it then. Game, set and match to him, and new balls please. He could almost hear the cogs grinding round in her head, trying desperately to find a hidden meaning in his words that could be somehow used against him. She was like that computer in war games, caught in a loop of her own ridiculous self-destruction. Was that it then? Was she leaving? With one final jab of her finger, ably assisted by a terrifyingly malevolent look with her ex-husband's name very much upon it, she departed. Sandra lingered momentarily, perhaps trying to weigh up her limited options, before a sisterly look of almost sub-zero temperature pulled her effortlessly through the door like Jane Torville. Humphrey allowed himself a rather self-satisfied little smile, the sort he wouldn't have dared to even think about giving an airing to in his ex-wife's presence. So, after 3 weeks of moving on with her life and being far better off without him, she'd finally cracked then, eh? That was a relief at any rate. He could handle most of the things that life seemed to delight in chucking at him, but Anthea's silent treatment was in a class of its own. Thank goodness he had at least one less thing to worry about now. It was, well and truly, one of those days, and Humphrey was slap bang in the middle of it. It wasn't quite in the same ballpark as the sort of days that Anthea regularly suffered from. Nobody was likely to end up being threatened with violence, simply because they dared to look at him the wrong way or anything like that. No, it was simply that the standard of potential client that had already audaciously auditioned for him that day had been, to cut a long story mercifully short, abysmal. He sincerely hoped that his own career might have hit its own rock bottom that day. A solid, concrete rock bottom too. Not one of those false ones, opening up to reveal even greater depths of human, fame-hungry desperation. Monty Price had been the first upon the scene that morning. He had brought with him no discernible talent, but he had thought to come equipped with his own placard, upon which he'd at least managed to scrawl the legend, "Ask for the price," albeit rather disturbingly in scarlet red crayon. The merest of inquisitions had established that this amazing ability to know his own name was in fact the bedrock of the man's entire audition. As far as it went, there was probably an act there, as the central component of a coconut shy perhaps, or maybe as some sort of still life display whose sole purpose was to direct shoppers to the bargain bin at the nearest supermarket. But show business? He had a great face for radio, that was the kindest thing that could be said for him, although in which case there seemed very little point in him having the placard. Unless, of course, he was planning on using it as a form of self-defence against life's more discriminating and pugnacious entertainment critics. During the course of their brief interview it had become glaringly obvious, certainly to one of them, that they were both simply wasting each other's time, although indeed the potential for the act had plunged to new levels with every passing moment. It had transpired that Monty's mate, a man with no name but an obviously over-enthusiastic sense of humour, had been the one with the bright idea to have his friend pop by. This, after having apparently noticed a remarkable similarity between a conservatively estimated 22-stone Monty and that noted female beauty, Jennifer Aniston. The man was certainly on something, although sadly not in any way on to it. In fairness, had there been a Jennifer Aniston lookalike anywhere in the immediate vicinity of that office, Humphrey would have been more than capable of finding that person a great deal of varied and gainful employment. However, no matter how many degrees he'd inclined his head by, and no matter how much he'd narrowed his eyes, he was buggered if he could see any similarity between that bloke and her whatsoever. Still, he'd been in the mood to be generous. They were presumably both human, that was a good start, and should the Hollywood star ever fancy growing a full beard and moustache, gaining about 200 pounds in flab and shaving every hair on her head? No, it was no use. She would still have looked nothing at all like that ruddy charlatan. Monty's mysterious mate had interested Humphrey a good deal more, though. He felt sure he'd be able to find him highly paid employment as a professional comedian. He and Monty might even be able to cobble together some sort of double act, or a double bill, yes, that might be a better way of phrasing it. Monty could always open things, although God only knew how. He would almost certainly have to incorporate a 50-metre head start on his pursuers. Of course, the bigger question was why Humphrey himself hadn't very quickly and rather ruthlessly just told Monty to take a hike. After all, any sensible person would have done. They would have slammed their door in his face, any sensible person. Except that, well, that sort of thing was a bit too predictable for Humphrey. He believed in giving everyone a fair hearing, even if most of the time it was fair to say he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. For Pete's sake, Jennifer Aniston, pull the other one. After a mug of strong tea and a few biscuits, it had been the turn of one Jeremiah Rudge. Humphrey had been reluctant to even write an approximate age on Mr. Rudge's audition form, as the man seemed to predate time itself. Doubtless he had been a fine figure of a fellow in his time. However, it would probably have been necessary to make contact with King Ethelred on some kind of long-distance Ouija board to independently verify that fact. Humphrey had been shocked to realise that he'd already formed an opinion on the chap pretty much before he'd even opened his mouth, which was most unlike him. He liked to think he could look beyond appearances, most of the time anyway. His own appearance in the past had practically invited enthusiastic criticism from complete strangers, and he was sure he was better than that. Before the diet, that was. Before Anthea. Yet there was no denying that he'd been able to hear the theme tune to Catweasel playing in his head as loudly as if the band had been right there beside them in that office. Not that Jeremiah would have heard it, of course, even given that sort of close proximity. As for an act, was there any call whatsoever, in this day and age, for a Catweasel impersonator? Catweasel. They didn't make programmes like that anymore. Everything was so fast-paced these days, wasn't it? Whatever happened to a nice, gentle evening's entertainment? A return to basics. That's what was needed. Goodness, he sounded like he was advocating some kind of austerity measure. Anthea would have had an absolute field day with his hankering for a nice, gentle evening's entertainment, too. On the subject of fields, perhaps Jeremiah could diversify into other forms of retro while he was about it, like the Crowman, for instance. Humphrey thought that whole scenario deserved a good deal more thought. He could take the role of Wurzel Gummidge himself, since Anthea had always insinuated that he used that character as some sort of style guru in any case. The cheeky cow. That was the sort of one-liner she had the ability to just come out with, almost completely out of nowhere. Acidic, crafted to wound, and tailored specifically to each individual victim. Especially him. Yet even when she was being a right bitch, she still had the ability to make him feel important to her. God, he missed her. But what about Catweasel? Humphrey had been seeing more and more retired people through his door of late. In fact, he'd recruited an entire replica cast of Dad's Army just the previous week. They would undoubtedly come into their own at village fetes, commemorative gigs of all descriptions, and as something of a doddery last line of defence in the event that the Germans ever decided to have another bash. The state pension obviously just wasn't enough to live on. Jeremiah must have seen it all, done it all, and paid 3 ducats for the doublet and hose to prove it, but he'd still been reduced to this, auditioning for Humphrey. He had plenty of oomph about him, though, and he didn't look as if he was going to be intimidated by the presence of an audience. He probably wouldn't be able to see them, and he almost certainly wouldn't be able to hear them. On top of which, his act had not been all that bad. Mind you, on any other day it might have seemed quite bad indeed, but Humphrey's internal good-bad calibration had found it almost impossible to suitably quantify Monty Price's performance, thereby virtually guaranteeing a positive score for young Catweasel. At least he had actually managed to make himself look like something vaguely useful. His audition had appeared to be some sort of ventriloquism, which was fine. There would always be a market for that. And he looked to be enjoying himself too, which was another positive. The only thing was, his lips were quite clearly moving, although, oddly, they didn't appear to be in sync with anything that was being said by anyone, anywhere in the room. Of course, that was just the sort of quirky genius that Humphrey could appreciate, although even he had to admit there appeared to be dark forces at work and no mistake. Proof of that could be found in the shape of Jeremiah's grinning associate, which was surely one of the most terrifying objets d'art ever to be presented for potential public scrutiny. It could have served quite comfortably as the doorman to the Room 101s of most of the world's population. Its eyes didn't just follow you around the room, They seemed to silently curse every move you made. Actually, the more Humphrey had forced himself to look at it, the more it had reminded him of Barney. Not the expression, of course. No, that was pure Anthea. But that oak and plywood combo. Except that Barney was an immense amount more wooden. And if push came to shove, that doll could probably just about carry a tune. Something out of Satan's private collection, no doubt, but still. And if all else failed, at least that horror could be chucked on a fire for warmth. What use was Barney ever going to prove to be? Barney. Why the hell was he thinking about him? Never mind him. The more immediate issue was the signing up of young Jeremiah, because one way or another, he could be a gold mine. 80s retro, that was the market. He was perhaps more 1880s retro, admittedly, but that wouldn't necessarily matter, not if he was packaged right. He could already see that dummy having a long show business career. Was he thinking about Barney again then? No, heavens to goodness, no. Oh, good grief, he was due in the office to see him later on, wasn't he? Unless Humphrey's luck was in that day and the world mercifully happened to end some time before then. No, it was Jeremiah's wooden friend he'd been thinking about. That thing had the sort of face that could comfortably warn an entire population off drink, drugs and smoking, all in one fell swoop, and with no arguments. Yes, perhaps some sort of public information role beckoned for him then. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs ought to be extremely interested in having that thing working the crowd for them for a start. Coffers would be overflowing in no time at all with him rattling the tin. He was more intimidating than the craze, he was. Humphrey checked his watch. 1:30. Barney would be here soon. He had to hand it to the boy. He was nothing if not resilient. He seemed, in fact, to be made of mental rubber. No doubt that was something for which Humphrey ought to have been taking some of the credit, if not, more specifically, the blame. He protected his client far too much. A protection that extended far, far beyond simply providing a cupboard for Barney to hide in after every horribly misguided singing attempt. As an entertainer, Barney almost literally defied words. Proof, if it were needed, could be found in that very morning's local newspaper, where even that description of him had been taken to a whole new level. Quite touchingly, it had initially been proud to call itself an entertainment review. There was a rather lovely photograph of the reviewer too, no doubt taken long before his trip to witness Barney the previous evening. Pounder a penny wouldn't be looking quite so chipper today. He'd be looking like someone broken on the rack today. The review itself had obviously been posthumously dictated following Barney's latest ignominious entertainment death. Words cannot even begin to describe what I witnessed here last night. And that was it. Short and unfortunately to the point. Barney had obviously attempted to sing. Again. Barney was a man for whom the phrase one-trick pony was simply insufficient as an adequate description. He was so devoid of talent that he could hardly do such a much-maligned nag any kind of adequate justice. And on the subject of much-maligned nags, Humphrey really was missing Anthea. Chapter 2. It was going to mean yet another call to the glazier. Crikey, no wonder Humphrey always told him to only ever contemplate taking baths. And his mum was going to kill him too. He'd only sung one note in the shower as well, although obviously it had been an absolute belter. Maybe he had perfect pitch. That was quite rare, that was, perfect pitch. He might mention that to Humphrey later on. Then again, perhaps he might not. It would all depend on his mentor's mood, after Barney had told him about last night. Over breakfast, he'd finally felt able to confront head-on the memory of the previous evening's performance. He'd managed to arrive at the venue in good time. That would have had to impress Humphrey at least. The Red Lion, yes. The place had only just opened, and it had been Barney's first ever engagement down there, although, judging by precedents set elsewhere, that invariably meant that it would almost certainly also prove to be his last ever engagement down there. He never seemed to be invited back anywhere. Barney was far from being what might be described as a superstitious fellow, but the omens hadn't been particularly encouraging right from the off. They'd been, for instance, A thunderstorm of simply epic proportions which had apparently sprung up from nowhere just as Barney was sorting out his bus fare. Brave to the last, he'd found a coat with a hood on it and had casually disregarded the event as simply God moving one or two items of his furniture around. Little did Barney know it, but Humphrey had also formed an opinion on the weather at the exact same moment that he had, although from the relative safety of his own office. His own theological interpretation of the meteorology had been identical, up to the point where the Lord had begun to rearrange his knickknacks. However, Humphrey had been convinced that a being of such undisputed wisdom would have gone a stage further than that, by bunging a few things into a few boxes and then skipping town in the back of a Pickford's van before things really did turn ugly. In short, before Barney could try to sing. The bad omens hadn't stopped there either. When a black cat tries to throw itself beneath the wheels of a delivery truck in its rush to position itself right in your path, that could just about be interpreted as being something vaguely promising in the good luck department. But when the avoiding action necessitated by the driver of that truck then causes the entire thing to overturn, resulting in the complete destruction of its cargo, 58 mirrors, well, it's enough to give even the most grounded of people the willies. His breakfast over, Barney checked his watch. 1:30. Oh well, time to confront his critics head on. As he took his seat on the bus to Brentwood, Barney gazed around him despondently. Why was nobody looking at him? Did nobody realise he was famous? OK, perhaps not famous. Not yet. That was Humphrey's fault, though. After all, Barney was out there engaging with the public. Actually, he'd even engaged in a spell of hand-to-hand combat with one or two of them the previous evening, but then again, they had been extraordinarily rude about his singing. At least they were likely to remember him. Surely Humphrey ought to be building on a foundation like that. Barney wanted to be famous. That was, in fact, pretty much the sum total of all his ambitions. Well, there were others, but there was no point in pursuing any of those until he was famous. Why wasn't he famous? Everybody else was. Hey, that was a thought. Perhaps he could become famous for not actually being famous. Yeah, that really was a thought. No, what would be the point of that? To be instantly recognised and worshipped in the street. That was what he really wanted. And that was pretty much all he wanted. Not much, really, in the grand scheme of things. Surely that must be achievable. Especially since he wasn't remotely interested in the majority of the associated trappings. The flash car, for instance, that wouldn't be necessary. He couldn't drive anyway, and even if he could, there would be very little point in him having a flash car if nobody even knew it was him in it. No, he would be going everywhere by public transport, just like now. Except that in the future, he would have to travel everywhere with a big box of glossy headshots and a marker pen, just in case. Oh, and in the future, he wouldn't have to borrow the bus fare from his mum. They'd be taken care of, though, his parents, when he was famous. He'd buy them a small palace somewhere, perhaps. Something modest. They could run his UK fan club from there. He doodled his name in the condensation on the window, just for practice. That really was a rubbish autograph. Every single letter was legible, and that would never do. It looked as though it had been written by a 6-year-old. He'd have to work on a decent signature. Oh yeah, and what about a heartfelt message to his millions of fans? Personally speaking, he'd always liked the warm sentiments associated with a best wishes from. In fact, he'd treasured for years an autograph from George, the blue-peated tortoise, which had earnestly conveyed that very sentiment. But then, how would that look? He carefully added the words to his name. Dear God. Right, enough was enough. There was no alternative. He was going to have to shelve the singing lessons for the time being and devote his every waking moment to getting himself a classier form of signature. His singing teacher would understand, if he could reach her. She'd become somewhat incommunicado since permanently moving to Australia and leaving no forwarding address. No doubt she'd realised that there wasn't a great deal that could be done with a voice like his. Yes, that'd be it. It was a shame, though, because he wouldn't be able to send her an autograph when he was famous. It was the very least she deserved, because that name was going to be worth a lot of money. Not that cash was any sort of motivation to him. No, it would be worth money to his fans. That's what he meant. Barney didn't want anything in the way of tangible rewards. World peace or something instead, that would do. He'd be happy with that, along with maybe just enough money to give him a comfortable lifestyle. Perhaps just enough to buy himself a nice little yacht or something. Something smart, where he would be able to entertain as many big-boobed gold diggers as could safely negotiate themselves up his gangplank. Yes, okay, he wanted fame with all the trimmings. So what? So what if they'd only be after him for his money? There was nobody even remotely interested in him at the moment, and he was as far removed from being rich as it was possible to be without having to resort to eating things out of bins. Other people's bins too. Real poverty. They wouldn't just be after his money though, these big-boobed gold diggers, because he'd be a celebrity, and that would mean he would automatically take delivery of bucketfuls of power and charisma. Why? Well, he just would, that's all. He might have to put up with a paparazzo living in his shed, of course, and that might very quickly prove intensely irritating. But none of that would really matter in the end, because he would be famous. Humphrey slumped down behind his desk with a family-sized bar of Galaxy and waited for Barney's sadly all too imminent arrival. If only the bloke would just stop singing for a while and actually start listening to him, they might be able to make a bit of progress. Humphrey was absolutely certain he had identified Barney's primary failing as a professional singer. The young man had an extremely disturbing tendency to open his mouth in any sort of public setting and attempt to make noises with it. Very, very unpleasant noises. Even his screams for immediate assistance in any sort of public setting could chill the blood of any potential rescuer. His own idea, a personal favourite, was to have Barney attempt something else for a while, although unfortunately it looked as though it would still have to fall within the darkest depths of the entertainment world, and so unfortunately it looked as though it would continue to be Humphrey's problem, for the time being anyway. Although he did feel an obligation to the boy, there was no denying that. Proof, if ever there was any, that Humphrey Lovewell was just too soft. He was thinking of Anthea there, why was that? Something about him being too soft. Oh Christ, mocking laughter too. Barney, he needed to focus on Barney. He was going to have to be harder, firmer, much more dominant. Humphrey broke off a large piece of chocolate. This was how it started the last time. Comfort eating. It had been for a completely different reason then, though. Or had it? Not Anthea, not then, but protection from countless painful aspects of his existence. It was a pathetic excuse, all right, but perhaps that was all he was as well. A pathetic excuse. Had he not heard it said enough times in his life from quite a number of independent sources? Disgusted by his own predictability, he shoved the chocolate in his mouth in one piece. It wasn't satisfying. He couldn't even taste it. So he broke off another much larger chunk and tackled that. He'd put on weight the first time from the age of 15. Attention-seeking, that was the technical term for it. That's what he'd called it anyway. It also made him extremely difficult to embrace properly, except by blood relatives of Mr. Tickle. That had been vitally important, since it had provided the perfect explanation, at least in Humphrey's mind, for the distinct lack of any kind of affection from the direction of his father. He had actually asked him for a hug once, although he couldn't quite remember why. He distinctly recalled being labelled a pathetic excuse for a boy for even making such a daft request, though. Michael wasn't someone he would ever have voluntarily wanted to spend any time in close proximity with anyway, which made the whole thing even more bizarre. In fact, he really couldn't even begin to imagine what he might have been thinking. He must have been on drugs or something. Well, yes, of course he had. Chocolate. It hadn't simply been a compulsive need to eat that had left him weighing more than an average household's furniture, though. Genetically, he was supposed to be lean and athletic, just like his father. Except that Humphrey had been blessed with far better legs than him and was therefore far better placed to be able to do justice to a netball skirt. That had been the attention-seeking too, of course. Oh heavens, he was reminiscing. That was all right, though. A brief trip down memory lane could be rather exhilarating. Why had the coin always come down on the side of fight, though, and not flight? That would have been far more sensible, certainly with his father. His late adolescence would have been different. Potentially even crappier, but different. His life now would be different. Not that his life now could get much crappier, but maybe he would still have Anthea. She'd never reminisced. Then again, she took a general, all-encompassing umbrage to most things almost immediately, so perhaps she didn't really see the need to. But there was so much more to her than that. That performance earlier on, for instance. She may not have reminisced, but she certainly remembered things, especially things he had done wrong, which, of course, was most things. Blimey, the event horizon preventing any nice memories from escaping from her mind must have been close to defying the laws of physics. It must have been like the end credits of Get Smart up there, with all those doors slamming shut. If indeed she had ever unlocked them to anyone or anything in the first place. Humphrey had obviously broken down one or two of them, and had made his lasting presence felt. He'd obviously got to her, although apparently not in any kind of a good way. He'd well and truly got the message that he'd managed to completely ruin her life, although she hadn't been too specific on precisely how he was supposed to have done that. But all wasn't lost, not by a long way, because even by giving him all of that somewhat destructive credit, she was acknowledging how important he'd been to her, which meant he had her attention. He was absolutely positive that she hadn't thought that one through. His own thoughts were interrupted by a face at the window of his office. For one awful moment he thought Barney was early for their appointment, but he relaxed considerably the second he realised it wasn't him. What on earth did that say about their working relationship then? Before he could further consider that question, the door opened. "Mr. Lovewell?" Hell's toenails, what was he supposed to say to that? He'd been caught out like this before. Admittedly, he'd been caught rather more off guard the last time. He'd answered the question truthfully through a locked door, which within seconds was being forced to its hinges by a pair of rather ferocious-looking bolt cutters. He then felt obliged to ask his own, somewhat cliched question of the intruder. "What the hell do you think you're doing then, you bastard?" Which had been met by a medley of four-letter expletives. It was a stupid question to ask, given the blatantly obvious circumstances, and he'd cursed himself for coming up with it, using some of the new abusive language he'd just learned. With hindsight, he should have asked the nice gentleman for his autograph, perhaps, or maybe to even pose for a photograph with him. Something completely unexpected. Then again, he might not still be alive to have these sorts of regrets if he'd done that. These debt collector types certainly took no prisoners. He'd managed to talk his way out of that one eventually. He could charm everybody, could Humphrey. Apart from his ex-wife, that is. Oh, and his father. The two most important people in his life. Allegedly. Yes, that was a bit of a waste of a gift then, really. Would it even work on this woman he was facing at the moment? She mightn't even be a debt collector. She did look a bit old to be in that sort of game. Although with the state of the country these days, that might not have made any difference. Except that he didn't actually owe anybody any money this time, did he? Or did he? Anthea hadn't left many major debts for him to have to worry about, having managed to get the house and all of its associated utilities from him during the divorce, together with a hefty chunk of his monthly pay packet for years to come. That was kind of her, really, because it left him with fewer long-term financial concerns in his own life. He didn't have to worry about putting any of his spare money anywhere it might have incurred debts either, because, thanks to Anthea and her brilliant legal advisor, he didn't have any spare money these days. She'd been thinking of him. That was the sort of person she was. Kind, considerate, or something like that anyway. That lawyer, though, he'd been purely out for himself. Well, if it wasn't something in his personal life, it had to be something to do with work. He quickly ran through the list of performers he had sent out into a largely unsuspecting world the previous evening. While none of them would have been in danger of ever actually setting the world on fire, they should all have just about been able to entertain people reasonably safely. If said people were not too fussy, and if said people had very low entertainment expectations. And if said people were drunk and preferably unconscious as well, it really couldn't hurt either. Actually, he might have been doing one or two of his clients a disservice with such a broadly dismissive description. One or two of them may well indeed have had the talent for a spot of global pyromania, albeit accidentally. Humphrey would have to clamp down on any act involving naked flames of any kind, just to be on the safe side. Barney bloody Adams, it must have been him then. That bloke already had more insurance policies on him than a seaside pier. This poor cow must be yet another one of his disgruntled punters. She'd be after damages then. Well, she certainly wasn't getting the rest of his chocolate, and he had nothing else of any value to offer her, apart from his body. Yes, so he had absolutely nothing else of any value to offer her. Mind you, she didn't seem to have any sort of psychopathic look to her. In actual fact, this woman looked half asleep. Christ, she was. How long had he been pondering her question? What the hell day was it? She had asked him a question, hadn't she? Right then. No. He was decisive. She was startled. No what? Humphrey hesitated. No being the answer to your question. Whatever it was. She obviously couldn't remember what she'd asked him either. They blinked at each other. I'm sorry, I didn't like to bother you just then. You seemed to be concentrating quite hard on something. Actually, I thought you might have been in the middle of a particularly nasty number 2 experience. Had he passed wind there? No. His charming face clearly needed a significant amount of work. I do beg your pardon, are you here to audition for me? Because you see, it might be better if you were to make an appointment. No, nothing like that. I am here on official business. Humphrey gulped. She must have her bolt cutters concealed in that pink gingham shopping bag. In that case, he feared for his deadbolt, he really did. Barney Adams. He eyed her suspiciously. She still wasn't getting his chocolate, whatever Barney's singing might have done to her. What about him? I'm here because of him. Hell's bells. I thought as much. Is this anything to do with his singing by any chance? The woman smiled warmly. His singing, his presence, his body, everything. Hell's bells with knobs on. That boy had obviously really done it this time. Just wait until he got his hands on him. May I ask, without admitting responsibility for him in any way whatsoever, what exactly you mean by that? Truth be told, he was almost afraid to know the answer. In historical terms, this was like asking Anthea if she wanted a romantic encounter instead of watching EastEnders. He should have been safe, and yet he never was. She'd always been able to do both, usually only missing the title theme of that god-awful programme in the process. I represent his fan club, Mr. Lovewell. That is to say, his Appreciation Society. Humphrey glanced outside. It wasn't sunny enough out there to induce such a dangerous case of sunstroke, surely. Are you feeling all right? Can I get you a glass of water, perhaps? The woman seemed overwhelmed by his humble offering. Perhaps she might have been impressed by his body after all. Would he have touched the glass, Mr. Lovewell? I don't think so, no. Barney and glass, they don't really get on. The woman nodded in agreement. That was interesting, as it implied she knew exactly who she was dealing with, warts and all. If Barney even had an all, he certainly never seemed to give it. What I want to know is, Mr. Lovewell. Humphrey waited. She was obviously going to ask him for the name and number of a good psychiatrist, perhaps, or whether he knew of somewhere she could get counselling. Ask Sandra. And with that, she and her gingham exited from the premises as fast as her elderly legs could carry her. Sandra? Anthea's Sandra? Humphrey glanced out of the window again and spotted what he had to assume was the reason for her hasty exit. There, using all his powers of concentration to push the button for the pedestrian crossing, was the old melody mangler himself, Barney Adams. Humphrey dearly wished he'd seen him at the same moment his fan had done. He'd have joined her very swiftly in her flight, that was for sure. Sadly, it was too late now. He returned to his chocolate and waited for his day to get even worse. After a good 3 or 4 minutes of sitting there, it occurred to him that one way or another, Barney really ought to have been there by now. Admittedly, the crossing often proved tricky for the boy, but there was almost always someone around who could help him. Reluctantly, and probably with the same lack of enthusiasm that his ex-wife had already commented upon that very afternoon, he dragged himself to his feet and gingerly approached the window. There was no sign of Barney anywhere. Buoyed on a wave of hope, always one of his greatest weaknesses, he opened the door and checked in both directions. Nothing. Could Barney really have just vanished into thin air? Could Humphrey really be that lucky? Past experiences clamoured for his attention, all desperate for the opportunity to remind him that he was not a lucky sort of chap at all, despite the mask of optimism he stoically wore as part of his day-to-day attire. He wasn't lucky, all right. Not many people were, as far as he could ascertain. The world was unpleasant, and life itself was often not much better. Yet there was always enough hope to make going on with it seem just about worthwhile. Humphrey himself would always appear to have just enough going for him to make him want to plough on and try to do better. The fates were cunning like that. Of course they were. They were women. "Hi, Humphrey." Just as he thought, he wasn't a lucky sort of chap at all. "Hello, Barney." The name of Humphrey's agency, somehow, was a masterpiece of self-deprecation. Of course, it had been christened back in the days before he'd met and married Anthea, when he still had total responsibility for his own deprecation. She'd very quickly taken over the running of that particular department from him, along with a remarkably long list of others. Somehow, it was definitely catchy. It gave no real indication to the general public as to what it was really about either. You really had to want to find out more. At the beginning, he hadn't even had a telephone number, and over the years, although he'd been steadily forced to accept certain technological advances through pure necessity, he had proudly continued to remain something of an enigmatic presence on the high street. He'd always believed in the value of face-to-face negotiations and business dealings. At least, he had until his marriage, anyway. That experience had managed to skew quite a few of his beliefs. In fact, some of them had been damaged quite beyond any sort of cost-effective repair. He'd established one thing right from the start. If folk wanted to find out what he was doing inside the offices of Somehow, then they would jolly well have to come inside and ask him. They wouldn't just be looking him up in a phone book and calling him from the comfort of their armchairs. No way. In later years, they wouldn't just be firing off a lazy and impersonal email either. No, if they wanted him, they had to find him. He wanted people who had made the effort to do that. The ones who had already thought things through. The ones who may well have followed a trail of dead ends that would have left all time wasters by the wayside. He wanted people out of their comfort zones to prove to him they meant business. Anyone who did that would get his undivided attention. All he had to do in the meantime was sit in his office eating crisps, waiting for them. It hadn't even been a show business agency, not in the beginning. Humphrey had originally been operating more as a renegade life coach. The fact that he was sadly lacking in all suitable qualifications had preyed on his conscience considerably, however, and he'd therefore decided it was best to be upfront about all that with his clients right from the off. Honesty seemed to be in short supply in most areas of existence, and he was going to try to redress the balance. The very notion of that had turned his father's face the same colour as a glass of Ribena, but that only served to spur Humphrey on. Hadn't that same spluttering figure told him on umpteen previous occasions, "Those that can do, while people like you will just have to manage somehow"? He should have been proud of him. There could always have been a first time. His father had never made the effort to try to understand him, that was the problem. One of them, at least. That name was a marketing masterstroke. Of course, under ordinary circumstances, the old git might have had a point. Voluntarily admitting to potential clients that you possess no actual talent of your own might not immediately seem to be a very sensible way of securing a regular income. And yet something truly bizarre had begun to happen. His honesty itself had become his talent. People instinctively felt they could trust him, and they could rely on him. Besides which, a man of the sort of gargantuan size that he'd been in those days would have been easy enough to hunt down and destroy if he and his coaching advice had really pissed anyone off. Then there were the prices. Humphrey still had in his possession the old fag packet upon which he'd worked out most of them. He treasured it even more these days, given that it was one of the few things he'd been permitted to keep by his ex-wife's down lawyer. The prices had needed adjusting as his popularity had increased, although, interestingly enough, he'd proceeded to make his services less expensive, Not what might have been expected perhaps, which was precisely why it appealed to him. He'd come full circle on that one. In the beginning he'd charged very little, but had then been forced to look on in horror as his clients completely ignored most of his advice. A quick soul search one morning in the company of 36 jam donuts had led Humphrey to the obvious answer. They hadn't valued his wisdom, simply because it hadn't cost them much. So he'd taken his fag packet and had then plucked from the air some of the most eye-watering prices ever seen outside of a budget airline's list of compulsory extras. Within a week he was turning down business, and so within a week he was able to reduce his prices back down to something slightly less reminiscent of blatant daylight robbery. His obvious popularity now rather bizarrely ensured his clients' trust, so an attack on their rainy day fund to focus their minds was thankfully no longer necessary. Money had never been his motivation. He'd leave his father and the others like him to worship distastefully at that altar. Meanwhile, Humphrey would have far more important things to do, like actually taking care of his clients, for instance. His success had boiled down to just one thing: belief. His charges had to believe in him, of course, but all he had to do was let them. All he had to do, in fact, was nothing. Nothing whatsoever. People would come through his door nursing long-held desires, things they passionately wanted to do or to change, things that they didn't think they had the courage to even try to achieve on their own. And Humphrey simply had to sit there and do nothing. Well, nothing except listen to them. That was a vastly underrated skill, though, actually taking the time to listen to people. Certainly, nobody had ever taken the time to listen to him. He didn't mean nodding vacuously at his clients while they were talking either, as an unseen internal jukebox cranked out a nice bit of loud muzak to prevent him from falling asleep through sheer boredom in mid-nod. He meant giving them his complete, undivided attention. The whole show business aspect of his career had blossomed from there. Well, perhaps not blossomed exactly. That might imply there'd been beautiful little buds of fresh talent sprouting up in every direction. It hadn't quite been like that. The showbiz hopefuls Humphrey had begun to cultivate were inclined by their very nature to require unbelievable levels of nurturing and attention, as well as almost infinite amounts of time and patience. That was something he could completely understand, even if, after all that, it was usually discovered that the resulting bloom did not really live up to any realistic horticultural expectation. However, rather than being humanely left to rot on some sort of slowly decomposing entertainment compost heap somewhere, most of his discoveries were subsequently able to make quite a reasonable living for themselves, one way or another. The ones with a burning desire to play the spoons in the orchestra at the Royal Variety performance, or with a desperate need to spend their remaining days as members of the virtually anonymous ensemble of a London musical, those were relatively easy to please. They were the hybrids, really, the ones who still had real and tangible dreams. Humphrey delighted in working with those people. Even if their goals proved just that bit beyond them, it almost always proved to be a mutually enjoyable experience. The journey towards the realisation, the new paths it could lead to, and what it said about them, that was the point. That was the key. But there were others, whose numbers he'd seen steadily grow throughout the years. They were completely different to the sorts of clients he'd originally been looking to help. They had neither the desire nor the inclination to even set themselves any realistic goals, and were usually after one of two things: fame or money. Or, of course, both. The pursuit of fame seemed to be the more popular, while, oddly, the idea of being rich without being famous appealed to relatively few people. In fact, there seemed a really rather incredible number who would have happily lived out their lives in the spotlight, even if it meant being forced to borrow the price of a cup of tea from the nearest charitable church mouse. Most of them would have been only too delighted to endure ongoing financial penury if it meant being recognised in the street by members of the public. And it didn't even seem to make a blind bit of difference to any of them what they were actually recognised for. Serial shagger? Result. Celebrity sponger? Nice one. One of Humphrey's rabble had in fact once reached the definitive all-time low of selling his own grandmother purely for the publicity. Fair enough, it had actually been Humphrey's idea, but he'd obviously never intended for it to ever be taken seriously. It had been said in exasperation as a throwaway remark. You would sell your own grandmother for the publicity. Just a throwaway, stupid comment, that was all. He had certainly not expected to find the woman's particulars in that week's edition of Exchange and Mart. Strangely enough, she'd then managed to attract more publicity out of the whole episode than her seriously put-out grandson, on account of the sudden onslaught of interviews and morning television appearances that had arrived hot on the heels of her best or near offer price. Humphrey could easily understand and indeed empathise with anybody who felt that they needed a bit of attention. He even recognised that complete inability to be able to differentiate between good or bad attention. Hence his own ill-advised teenage adventures with his father. But that was different. Most of these people were literally a danger to themselves. Barney Adams. Yes, a prime example there, if ever there was one. Well, you wanted to be famous, Barney. Tell me, do wanted posters count? Barney did not quite understand all aspects of that question. Or was it two questions? If it was two questions, they surely couldn't be in any way associated. Because if they were, then Humphrey clearly didn't know him very well. Barney's mental processing powers were fragile at best. But there was no shame in not being an intellectual. How many of them were famous? No, it was no good. He'd never be able to get the hang of this thinking lark. The echo was giving him a splitting headache for a start. Oh, great. It looked like Humphrey was going to answer his own question. Or was it two questions? Well, however many it was, that would probably be the best plan anyway. Barney might have to ask him for an aspirin or two once he'd answered his own question. Was it two questions? It is fame you want, is that right? Not money? Oh, absolutely. In any case, you don't need to be rich once you're famous, because it's implied. Humphrey eyed him suspiciously. Implied by who, exactly? Barney was aghast. Humphrey was supposed to be a man of the world. Well, women, of course. Women. Humphrey threw his pen down in exasperation. So, women. The whole sorry saga had taken a grave new turn. When you say women, Barney, are you perchance thinking of fame-hungry gold diggers, just by any chance? With big boobs? Yeah, that's it. This time, Humphrey threw up his hands in exasperation. Barney's own hands were clearly holding two imaginary approximations of these apparently desirous attributes. Either that, or he just grabbed hold of two invisible prize-winning watermelons. The poor sod was becoming a parody in front of his very eyes, a stereotype. It was but a short, paparazzi-infested journey from honest and hard-working artist to shameless media whore. And even if he did become famous, once any of the sort of girls he was dreaming of got their hooks into him, they'd have all the sordid details in Crap or Rubbish or some similar trash magazine before anyone could say they'd slept with and then cheated on Jack Robinson. Well, he wasn't going to be dragging Humphrey down that slippery slope with him. Boobs the size and texture of the stone spheres of Costa Rica might well appeal to those who couldn't think for themselves, but there were other options, far more realistic ones. Like the sort of boobs that resembled a couple of old sandbags, the sort that came halfway down to their owner's knees every time she took a bra off. Yes. As far as Humphrey was concerned, there was a great deal to be said for the likes of them. And God, how he missed Anthea. Don't you want to hear what happened last night? I already know, Sonny Jim. Your singing defied description. Is that good? This was the sort of pivotal moment where Humphrey really earned his money. He sat on his hands, though, just in case they betrayed his measured calm and made an independent lunge towards Barney's throat. Well, let's look on the bright side. At least you're getting noticed. Barney beamed back at him. Such a wide-eyed, trusting expression. Just like a baby seal. A baby seal who assumes he's about to be fawned over, but who is in much greater danger of being brutally clubbed to death. Humphrey scrutinised him. He'd seen that expression in his own mirror enough times to be able to identify with it on every single level. That had been him, all those years ago, desperately trying to get noticed, usually by doing the wrong things. With Barney it was the singing, or the attempt at singing at any rate. With him it had been the embracing of his more artistic side. He'd stood there, like Barney now, and silently begged for his father's attention. And he'd got it too. He shifted very slightly in his chair as he remembered the usual way that attention had manifested itself. Nevertheless, if someone is taking his belt to you, he cannot, by definition, be dragging his trolley round the golf course or propping up the clubhouse bar, although that wasn't to say that he hadn't been there in spirit. That was a depressing thought. Could it really have been that even those precious times together hadn't been all they'd seemed? Then again, it would have been no worse than what Humphrey himself was doing to Barney at that very moment. What about that promise made all those years ago to always listen intently to his clients? As long as this particular one did not try to burst into song, of course. Did you know you've got a fan club? Barney was obviously pondering that question. He was frowning so hard it looked as though his face was collapsing on itself, which could still have been a major improvement. No? Me? I know, it's astonishing, isn't it? Wait though, that woman had called herself an appreciator, hadn't she, not a fan? Was there a difference between the two definitions? It would seem to be arguing semantics, and for no particularly good reason. Whoever these people were, they were clearly off the charts in terms of good sense, taste and sanity. The whole thing was obviously beyond Barney's limited comprehension, along with most things, in all honesty. Now, how was Humphrey going to break it to him that the woman he'd met earlier on did not exactly have the boobs of his dreams? Mind you, Sandra might easily fall rather top-heavily into that category. Not that her former brother-in-law had ever noticed or anything like that, although it had been extraordinarily difficult not to sometimes. And that woman was a fan of Barney's. Life wasn't fair, it really wasn't. There were so many questions that had been left unanswered when that lady in her gingham had gone, and there was really only one way for Humphrey to try and find out some of the answers. He would have to go and find Sandra. And how would he find Sandra? He'd just have to go and ask Anthea. Yes! Finally, an excuse to go and see her, without having to look like he wanted to see her. Fantastic! But he couldn't really mention the bit about wanting to find Sandra, because it would be just awful if Anthea became jealous. And it would be utterly catastrophic if she didn't. Perhaps he'd be better off staying right where he was and finishing his chocolate. Do you mean that people actually like me? God, just look at him. Honestly, if he put on a bit of makeup and had his eyebrows plucked, it really would have been like looking in a mirror from the 1980s. Damn right they do. I will say this though, I don't know enough of the details yet to be able to ascertain precisely why they do. Frankly, I wouldn't even like to hazard a guess in that direction until I've looked at least one of them right in the eyes and seen for myself how far her pupils are dilated. But people actually like me. Humphrey swallowed hard. Yes, son. Of course they do. I couldn't have done it without you. You believe in me, don't you, Humphrey? Hang on. Was that a statement, a question, or a threat of some description? Humphrey was taking no chances. My God, Barney, look at that! Bless him. Barney could only ever really successfully focus on one item of importance at any one time. He did well to be able to breathe and move around simultaneously on a day-to-day basis. Now here he was engaged in an intensive search of the immediate area for the imaginary diversionary tactic that Humphrey had deployed. Never mind, his short-term memory wasn't brilliant. Hopefully by the time the search was called off, he would have forgotten all about that absurd little line of inquiry. There was only one way to find out. Sorry, Barney, you were saying? Barney looked puzzled, then confused, and then hopelessly lost. Bingo! Oh, well, not to worry. It can't have been all that important then, can it? What can't, Humphrey? Dear God Almighty! Surely he'd never been this obtuse, had he? Even as he thought that, he became acutely aware of a different group of memories which were beginning to organise themselves into an orderly queue ready for his attentions. He tried to remain one step ahead of them. All right then, Barney, onward and upward. I have got you a gig next Tuesday. Before you ask, yes, we can call it a singing engagement if we really have to, but I do advise you to work on a backup act if that is going to be the case. Something like the Duke boys used to do, diving into your own General Lee without having to stop to open the doors first and then doing 0 to 60 in 4 seconds. It's at that wine bar on the way up to the station. Barney looked concerned. Or maybe he simply had indigestion. It was really very difficult to say. I thought I was banned from there. Crikey, he was right. Humphrey should have remembered that. Of course, it was terribly difficult keeping track of all of Barney's various ASBOs and restraining orders. Each one seemed to have its own unique little clauses and legal jargon. The one taken out by the vicar of one of the local churches was his own personal favourite. Humphrey dispatched his tuneless troublemaker down there to sing at a harvest festival of all things. It sounded ridiculous in hindsight, of course it did, but then Barney's singing tended to sound ridiculous in pretty much every single circumstance. That was still no reason for the vicar to have double-crossed them like that, though. You really couldn't trust anyone these days, it was true. Once Barney had frightened all the mice away from the comestibles, the clergyman had only gone and called the police on him, and young Barney had eventually found himself banned from the church and the grounds, to a depth of 6 feet, on the basis that singing like his could awaken the dead, which was a very real threat Humphrey had been reluctantly forced to concede. But what about that wine bar? Ah, yes, that's right. Barney wasn't allowed to go within 100 metres of there. Was that right? Or was that the distance he was required to keep away from that double glazing showroom? Would 100 metres from anything be able to provide an adequate buffer zone from the horrors that could be unleashed quite effortlessly by that charismatically clueless cord crusher? He'd have to check the paperwork again. He wouldn't be the least bit surprised to discover it was a 100-mile exclusion zone they were actually dealing with. At least. Chapter 3. Sandra lived in an immaculate little cottage in one of the swankiest streets in the area. She was happily married, although her husband worked away for the majority of the time, the two statements being perhaps not entirely unconnected. She'd found him that job herself, as a matter of fact. He had never looked smarter in his life than he had on the morning of that interview. She'd personally made sure of that. She'd even promised him a bit of extra special love action if and when he signed that permanent contract. What did she care? It had meant a little bit of extra effort in the short term, but the potential rewards were almost limitless. A tidy house, the toilet seat reassuringly horizontal, the freedom to be able to express herself whenever she liked by breaking wind, biting her toenails or scratching her bum. All of this with the added romance of a long-distance relationship as well. A relationship sustained for the most part by passionate telephone conversations, an account with interflora, and 2 vivid and sex-starved imaginations. Anthea had always been jealous of her. Of course she had. A lifetime of her sister being prettier than she was, more popular than she was, and, most importantly, younger than she was, had definitely taken its toll on the poor old bag. The discovery that Humphrey was nothing but an annoyingly useless waste of space when compared to a real man like Sandra's had been a slow, gradual process. It was a question of romance, really. While Sandra's husband was sending her 24 roses, Humphrey was unblocking his wife's U-bend. While Sandra's husband was calling her from Hong Kong with a list of his passions and desires, Humphrey had been calling Anthea from Sainsbury's with a list of that day's special offers. While Sandra was allowed to live with the intrigue and mystery of the unknown, Anthea had been anchored very much in the known and the predictable, with Humphrey. The money that miraculously appeared in Sandra's joint bank account each month was more than sufficient to keep her from either the dole queue or the rush hour commute. Instead, she was able to indulge herself, to relax, always with the very important caveat that she was doing whatever it was for her husband. She helped Anthea out in her shop sometimes, usually when she felt a bit low and needed someone to stand next to who would make her feel instantly better. Apart from that, how could she work? How could she keep regular toiling hours when her husband's time back with her might only be a few hours? What employer would ever give her time off at the drop of a hat so she could quickly run home to massage her husband's feet, crutch and ego, and not necessarily in that order, and then not mind in the least when she then had to call in sick for the rest of the week because of a sudden inability to be able to walk properly? No, she owed it to her husband to be there whenever, and indeed wherever, he needed her. When he phoned her late at night and asked her what she was wearing, she had a duty to be modelling the full lingerie ensemble. Well, That is to say, she had a duty to have nothing else on her mind to distract her while she attempted to at least convince her husband that was what she was wearing. After all, he couldn't see her, and a tracksuit was so much more comfortable, and a lot less drafty. Sandra did miss her husband immensely while he was away, though, and she would always count down the days until his return. He would simultaneously be doing the same, allowing for whichever time difference happened to be relevant at the time. She'd asked him to always give her a week's advance notice of any return. That allowed her to concentrate on him and to realise just how much she'd missed him. It enabled her to look forward to seeing him again and to feel the thrill of organising the various pampering, polishing and pruning sessions that would ensure she looked her best for him. New underwear would always have to be purchased too, something very similar to the sort of stuff she'd been pretending to wear anyway during those late night hot and heavy phone conversations. The house would be cleaned to within an inch of its life, and every surface would be completely cleared of clutter. She'd learned the hard way that her husband had a tendency to want to continue his travels, even at home. For the purposes of keeping their mutual flame alive, this very much left every room in their cottage open for business. Items left on tables or other solid areas of about waist height were likely to end up strewn all over the floor, having been slowly edged to their doom by the momentum of her naked backside, like some kind of pornographic penny falls. The excitement would peak just before he arrived home, at around about the time she heard his taxi pulling up outside. Yes, things usually did seem to go downhill from there, actually, when she looked back on it. The period of time between that sound and her husband almost metaphorically putting his key in her door tended to signal the start of the decline. What if the house wasn't good enough? What if she put on too much weight? What if he didn't like the new curtains? Things would pick up again significantly when she saw him, though. He had a fabulous way of hugging her that made her ribs crack. She liked that. It made her feel helpless and delicate. He used to spin her around in his arms a few times too, but he hadn't done that for a while now. Perhaps the double hernia he'd so narrowly avoided that last time still preyed in his mind. But he would always kiss her passionately, groping at her breasts as he did so. Then there'd be a break in the action, because it was always around about now that he'd remember the taxi driver stood beside him on the doorstep with the luggage and waiting patiently for his tip. Or maybe his turn. That was good for her self-esteem. Whatever. The point was, it was always the same. The luggage. That would be where things would start to go seriously wrong. He wasn't planning on leaving all that rubbish there, was he? Couldn't he see that the place was immaculate? Why were his shoes dumped in the corner like that? He wasn't going to leave his trousers and underpants in a pile by the door now, was he? Why couldn't he get them dressed tidily? Should she put a load of washing on? Did he want a beer? Did he want a sandwich? Had he seen the curtains? Did he like her hair? Why was he looking at her like that? Oh yes, right, of course. Within an hour the house would be trashed. The bedroom would always cop it first. There was a certain amount of comfort to be derived from that, she supposed. At least he still found her attractive. And at least his first action upon returning home wasn't to just put his feet up in front of Sky Sports News and fall asleep. The bathroom always looked like it had been on the receiving end of a direct hit from a doodlebug. Given all the countries her husband had visited, could it really be possible that not one of them had a law against leaving the toilet seat up? It was only ever at times like these that she'd felt at all envious of Anthea. Before the divorce, anyway. Humphrey may well have been under her sister's feet most of the time, but at least he'd been house-trained. The way he'd always looked at Anthea, too, she envied that. His was not the gaze of a man who couldn't wait for his wife to take her clothes off. It was more the adoring eyes of someone who was thanking his lucky stars that she still had all of them on. Sandra's husband never looked at her like that. He couldn't do, really, working as he was within such severe time constraints. But there was no denying it. She always ended up feeling cheap. She wanted to make dinner for him, to bring him his newspaper, to listen as he regaled her with tales from his travels. She wanted him to tell her how beautiful she was. Not in a way that suggested he thought her words were some sort of skeleton key that might get her to open her legs. She wanted him to say it because he meant it. And damn it, because it was true. By the time she'd whizzed through a few wash cycles and got her ironing board out, he would be preparing to leave again, and Sandra would find herself counting the minutes until he did, because then she could start missing him all over again. She could start trying to remember all the things she loved about him, while at the same time trying to forget about that incredibly long list of immensely irritating things she really didn't like about him at all, but which he always seemed to be able to squeeze into every single return visit. She would be ready to sell her own soul just to be able to get out of whatever remained of that wretched lingerie too, which was why she always ironed her tracksuit first. He would always call her from the departure lounge to thank her for a wonderful time and to tell her that he loved her. Oh, and that she was beautiful. Oh yeah, and that he had noticed her new hair and the new curtains, and that he would have told her so over a nice, quiet little meal at the local bistro, but that he'd simply not wanted to waste a single moment of their time together engaged in pointless conversation, not when she was so sexy. And from beyond passport control, that always sounded romantic. It always sounded sincere. Its somewhat more chauvinistic overtones completely overlooked in the thrill of the moment. Romance, that was the thing. That was something Anthea didn't have. Chapter 4. Humphrey sank into his chair. The pleasure of seeing the back of Barney was almost worth the hassle of having him there bugging him in the first place. He sighed. He was just going to have to be patient, that was all. He could be patient. He could be very patient. He'd once patiently played 77 games of Minesweeper on the computer, waiting for Anthea to give up waiting for him and go to bed on her own. And he could easily have played another 77 as well. Not that he wouldn't have happily engaged in any number of different carnal activities with a woman. Once he'd steeled his nerves with at least a bottle and a half of vodka, that is. It was simply that any appointment of that nature seemed to be always doomed to failure. Anthea's expectations far exceeded his rather pathetic abilities. Although there was some comfort to be derived from the certainty that even an exchange visitor from Krypton would have felt nervous about a potential romantic encounter with Anthea. Even if he escaped relatively unscathed during the performance, there would still be hostile reviews of some description to be faced. Which sort of sounded like Barney's singing career, really. Perhaps he and Barney were a lot more similar than he'd ever fully appreciated. Except there was still some hope for Barney. They really were just going to have to be patient. At the end of the day, Barney was still only learning the ropes of his chosen profession. Learning the ropes, wasn't that some old nautical term? He quickly ran through the lyrics of In the Navy, but was left with few answers. He resolved to play himself the accompanying video later on that evening, purely for research purposes. He might even allow himself a look at Macho Man too while he was about it. Something about that idea unsettled him. Maybe it was the thought that his old village people biker costume might be too big for him these days. The moustache might be good to go though, surely. After all, a good moustache fits any face. And why was he thinking of Anthea? He was thinking of something else too. What was that? Whatever it was the image of that moustachioed character that was doing it. Where was he now? 1985. Christmas. Yes, Christmas Day, 1985. Just him and his father. Oh yes, he could see him there now, checking his watch every 5 minutes and drinking whiskey by the festive barrel. 15 years old that whiskey was, the same age Humphrey had been at the time. And there were no prizes for guessing which one of them the old bastard was happier spending his Christmas with. Oh look, he was wearing his new belt. A strange, almost bizarre gift for Humphrey to have got him, although in some ways it had been perfect. He'd certainly not been expecting it. Nor had Humphrey been expecting any of the things he'd received that day either. There'd been no Cindy doll, that was the biggest trauma. No, of course there hadn't. Never mind the fact he might well have wanted her for quite legitimate purposes, like irritating the hell out of his father, for instance. Nobody had even thought to ask him why she'd appeared on his Christmas wish list. No, Santa Claus had quite obviously just leaked the list in its entirety to his father, who had stepped in and apparently taken it upon himself to write Humphrey a new one, requesting rugby boots, an action man, and a signed photograph of Jill Gascoigne. Maggie Forbes had subsequently disappeared into the depths of his father's briefcase. That was her life over then, over and done with. Poor woman, there'd be no more gentle touches for her. Meanwhile, the rugby boots had been filled with compost before Noel Edmonds had even pulled his first televised cracker that day, and were set to be planted, in the not-too-distant future, with the most effeminate flowers Humphrey could come up with. Something pink, definitely, and not carnations either, they were far too respectable. The Action Man. That had to be the reason for Humphrey's trip back to this particular memory. It hadn't even been the real one, just some half-price version. But it had been a really macho one, with a number 1 haircut and a moustache. Really macho. Like his father, in fact, with his calfskin gloves and his sheepskin slippers. But unlike his father, Mr. Man had clearly been overcompensating in his choice of profession. That was quite obvious to a trained observer. Mr. Man had no doubt been forced against his will to follow a career as near as damn it 180 degrees away from the one he'd been born to, which was a ballet dancer, more than likely, or possibly a flower arranger. Perhaps he could even advise Humphrey when the time came to plant out his new rugby boots. Anyway, it was the fault of a greedy multinational toy empire, or its Romford Market equivalent, that he had instead enlisted in the Marine Corps. He had to have a secret. That uniform, that haircut, that moustache, there had to be something. Nobody could possibly be that masculine in real life. Although that was clearly the reason he'd been parachuted into Humphrey's stocking in the first place. Or at least into Humphrey's pair of stockings. 10 denier. Well, he did have the legs for them, and he'd taken the calculated risk that his father would be highly unlikely to want to break in his new high-quality leather gift quite that soon. Maybe Mr. Man himself wore tights, perhaps that was his secret. Maybe he sobbed until his heart broke during Bambi. Maybe he cried every time he had to chow down, overwhelmed by the sacrifice made on his behalf by any sort of reconstituted former living creature. Whatever it was, there was no way that man, or indeed any other, could possibly be 100% masculine. Whatever being a man actually meant. And what about his father? What was his secret? Being a greedy, arrogant and vain son of a bitch probably didn't betray too much in the way of a feminine side. Most women of Humphrey's experience were far too intelligent to feel the need to get involved with any of that sort of rubbish. Michael Lovewell would most definitely not have cried during Bambi. He would never have had the time to watch something like that in the first place, and even if he had, he would have empathised far more with the huntsman who pulled the trigger. In fact, he'd have probably helped him sell off the venison steaks down at the golf club. What about silk underwear? Was that feminine? It would have been if Humphrey had been wearing it. He'd have made sure of that. He'd have nipped straight down to the Marks and Spencer lingerie department and let rip. Although probably not literally, as he hadn't yet embraced obesity to quite that extent. He definitely embraced his feminine side, though. What was the difference between a pair of silk boxers and a pair of silk panties anyway? After all, neither one of them could offer all that much by way of testicular support. Humphrey could no more answer that question now than he'd been able to in 1985. All he did know was that the presence of silk panties about his person had pretty much guaranteed his father's attention, especially that first time where they had, at least in part, been responsible for the man's immediate physical return from some fundamentally unimportant, far-flung field of legal flim-flam.